Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations, the traditional owners and custodians of the land where we're meeting and whose sovereignty was never ceded. And I want to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands where our virtual attendees are all joining us from today. I pay my respect to the elders of these peoples, past, present, and emerging, as well as to any Indigenous people here with us today. Our Whyte Lectures are a forum for thought leadership in the librarianship, archives, and records disciplines. Named after Emeritus Professor Jean Whyte and Phyllis Whyte, the lectures exist thanks to the generous bequests left by the sisters that enable our faculty and the Monash libraries to carry out transformative research. This year, we're excited to change the traditional format of this annual event to showcase 3 projects that have been supported by the Whyte Fund over the last years. So in each presentation, you will discover how our researchers have creatively applied archives, records, and information systems to tell stories, preserve integral knowledge, and share history. Today, you will hear from Dr. Monika Schwarz, who is a research fellow in SensiLab, which is a joint lab between the Faculty of IT and the Faculty of Art, Design, and Architecture. And Monika works with creative technologies, which is also the main focus of SensiLab. The second speaker will be Dr. Tom Chandler, who is a senior lecturer in the Faculty of IT and who specializes in 3D modeling and virtual world building. And then last but not least, Emeritus Professor Sue McKemmish and Dr. Narissa Timbery from our new Information Empowered Communities Lab, which partners with Indigenous and marginalized communities in Australia and the Global South to use information for holistic empowerment. So just some housekeeping before we welcome our first speaker. Our virtual attendees are encouraged to type questions into the Zoom Q&A. During the Q&A portion, there's a dedicated question box in your Zoom, so you can just please add any questions you have in there. And for the guests in the room here today, we will have a roving microphone so that everyone can hear your questions. Also, please note that this is a recorded lecture and the replay will be placed on the faculty's website and shared via its social media. So now I would like to officially welcome Dr. Monika Schwarz to the stage to talk about A Stitch in Time, creating novel access points to Australia's convict records with data embroidery. Drawing from records of Van Diemen's Land held by the British bureaucracy, Monika's project uses data embroidery to tell the stories of real female convicts, focusing on their resilience and resourcefulness. The historical archives are brought to life through creative needlecraft and embroidery. So welcome, Monika.
Today, I'm going to talk about our project, Stitch in Time, where we used a new form of data embroidery, of data physicalization, which we call data embroidery, to tell Australian convict stories. And so in a nutshell, what we did in this project is we created 18 data embroideries based on the lives of 21 convict women. And my partners in crime were John McCormack from Monash SensiLab and Hamish Maxwell Stewart, who is a professor for digital history at UNE. He's based in Hobart. We based these embroideries on traditional timeline visualizations, and they are currently exhibited at the Penitentiary Chapel in Hobart. And we also managed to publish this recently at an IEEE visualization conference, which took place last month here in Melbourne. So we consider this very successful. I start with some background. Many of you might have learned that in school, but that's where I'm going to pick it up. Between 1788 and 1868, about 168,000 people were transported to Australia as convicts. They came mostly from Ireland and from England. And about half of them, a little bit less than half of them, were actually transported to Hobart in then Van Diemen's Land and today Tasmania. 13,600 of those were female convicts. And once they were transported, they were expected to serve something between 7, 14, or 21 years under servitude, which means they were assigned to settlers, free settlers, and they were expected to work as servants. And for as long as these convicts were under servitude, every aspect of their life was recorded in minute detail in the convict records. And that's one of these leather-bound huge ledgers where this information was kept. If I open one of them, that's what it looks like on the inside. What that means for us today is that we have an extraordinary source of a particular slice of a 19th century population where we have extraordinary details which we can use to analyze them. And if you look at that slide, you can already see, so this is 3 convict women, it's their conduct record. What you can already see is that the one in the middle is rather dense, and there's much more entry there than with the others. That's actually the conduct register of Catherine Henrys. She was an Irish house servant. She was Irish, but she was actually transported from England, where she worked as a house servant. She was already 25 years old when she was transported for highway robbery. Or as she said, she attacked a man in the street. Her conduct register, so should put it out, there's first some, in that box, there's some general information about the convicts. And then to the right of that, there's some information about why she was transported. And then underneath in that section, that's the conduct register. That means every offense that a convict offended in the colonies under servitude was kept in there. A record was kept about that. In Catherine's case, that page wasn't enough. She had to have a supplement page. And then when they ran out of space, she actually had to have another supplement page. Because even though she was a house servant by profession, that she just had other ideas. We have other examples for these convict records. It's not just the conduct registers. This is a permission to marry register. And in the 3rd row, you will find Dobbs Samuel and Catherine Henrys. They applied for marriage and they actually did get married. And something that was done right on the ship at arrival, even before the convicts left the ship, even before they set foot in this new country, a description list entry was done. And from this description entry, we actually know a lot about what they looked like, which is helpful. Luckily, I don't actually have to work with these original records, as beautiful as they are. But as you probably know, records are always in the state of becoming. And it's certainly true for the convict records, because they are increasingly getting digitized and transcribed. And what I actually worked with, or still work with, is the Digital History Tasmania database. This is open at the page for Catherine Henrys, and this is the transcribed version of her description list, from which we know that she had black hair, she had broad nose, she was pock-pitted, and she was actually rather tall. That translates to 1 meter 68, which is about here, so rather tall for her age and her gender. The problem with working with such a huge database is what you can see is that these are all different tabs. They all refer to different sources of information, and trying to establish something like a timeline for each convict started to get, it's actually quite difficult, which is why we decided that we create these timelines. We take all this information and we made this, that's the Lifelines visualization. That was actually a related project where I made this for. This is Catherine Henrys' timeline. It usually starts with her trial and then her journey to Australia. Every single circle is an offense that she committed. You will find a lot of drunkenness in her case. Those bars underneath refer to time spent in secondary punishment, like the female factories. What I want to point out with Catherine Henrys is something that shows up time and again are abscondings. I hope you can read that. There's an absconding, there's a few more. It goes through. Because that's the thing about Catherine Henrys. She actually didn't want to work as a house servant. What she did time and again is she just took off. And she got so renowned for this that she actually, she got a nickname, Jamie the Rover. And there's 2 newspaper articles down in Van Diemen's Land outlets that feature Catherine Henrys, alias Jamie the Rover. This is one of them, which has 2 interesting bits of information. One of them is that Catherine Henrys has a penchant for wearing the inexpressibles. And that's usually where I ask the audience if you have any idea what that means. Anybody? Guess? It means, say again? That's right. She wore pants. Inexpressibles are pants. She wore pants. And that's why I pointed out on the description list that she had a broad nose, she was rather tall. She was able to pass herself off as a man. And that's made her extremely successful as an absconder. She was able to spend months outside the system before she got caught again. And we also know from this newspaper article what she did when she hid away. She was in the bush splitting and fencing. And that's apparently the lifestyle that she preferred to being a house servant. So I think this creates quite a picture. And this is how I drew her. Splitting wood and wearing her inexpressibles. And in order to get to a data embroidery, you have to digitize that, so you get an SVG. And then the next thing we did is we took one of these lines of the SVG, in this case it was the arm. We convert the lifelines visualization so that it no longer goes on a straight line, but it follows the outline of the arm. And then you bring that together. Create a new SVG, and you turn that into an embroidery. And that's the finished embroidery of Catherine Henrys. And the blue dots, the blue offenses that are highlighted in the embroidery, that's all her absconding events, all her abscondings. Some more technical details at the back. In order to create the embroidery, we used specific software, embroidery software, which is called Brilliance. And then we have an embroidery machine at the Sensi Lab where we actually created all these embroideries. So that's the technical side. Why did we use embroidery? When I started to engage with convict women and I read up on their history, it just struck me very quickly that convict women's lives were closely related to fabric and to needlecraft. So much so that they actually were taught needlecraft on the ships when they came to Australia. And that's how this quilt came into existence. It was done by convict women on board of the ship Raja, and it's now in the National Gallery of Australia. It's going to be on display starting next March in a quilt exhibition. If convict women weren't servants of some sort by profession, the second strongest category is actually women who worked as needlewomen or dressmakers. So that's just what women at the time were able to do other than working as servants or as prostitutes. So that was the reason why I went with embroidery for this. And then the other reason for actually focusing on convict women is this is the kind of imagery that I was able to find about convict women. So these are the squalid conditions of a London prison. To the right are London street scenes that are caricatures. In the middle is a woodblock print on a pamphlet from the 19th century from London. That's pretty much all you can find. And the images are usually, the servants are shown, servants or convict women are shown as coarse creatures, wild, usually quite old, or at least in this case, looking demure enough. That's the imagery, but the literature about convict women matches that. They were described as depraved and disorderly, or as drunken hussies, all of this. And the historians from the time on for a couple of decades actually just repeated this picture until a new group of, a new generation of historians, mostly female historians, starting from the 70s, actually started to revise this picture. Very often they did something revolutionary. They actually went back to the records and had a look if that actually fits to the image that was created before. And thanks to a couple of really engaged female historians, nowadays we have a different picture of convict women. It's no longer drunken hussies and criminals. It's also no longer victims. But I'd say today we look at them as a group of women who within their means took agency over their lives. And that's what I wanted to do in this project. I wanted to base them on the convict records. And I focus a lot on acts of resilience and resourcefulness. And to me, the best moments were always those when I had the feeling that a woman's character is shining through the records. And here's a couple of examples. This is Elizabeth Elmore, and she once got sentenced for concealing a pipe and a match in her boot. So that's resourcefulness. This is Elizabeth Studham. She actually is the only female swing rioter who got transported for participating in protest. That stayed with her. She was once sentenced to 6 months on the wash tub because she refused to return to service. She didn't want to, no, it's a bit distracting. She didn't want to return to her service. And said to the magistrate, could somebody please turn off that? Okay, so she said to her magistrate that she'd rather spend 12 months in the female factory than return to her service. And 6 months on the wash tub is actually what women in the crime class in the factories did. So she got her will in that sense. So that was resilience. And then we have Mary Cuttle. She has a very long 20-year passing spanning time in the convict system. But the very first offense, soon after she leaves the ship, is that she went out at night in a pub and she wore her mistress' jewels. So that tells us a lot about her character. And then lastly, we have Maria Wright, who time and again got sentenced for using very, very bad language and insolence. And also that tells us a lot about her character. And that leaves me with pointing out again that this is how the exhibition is currently displayed in Hobart. That's how we set it up. That was the opening night, was very well visited. It was a great night. But if you don't want to travel down there to see them, I actually brought a couple of samples, which we are going to put outside on the table so you can have a look at them. You can even touch them. They're very tactile. That's a new aspect of them. Thank you, Tom. So come and find me outside on the table later if you're interested. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much. Now I've got so much, Dr. Schwarz. I'm Anne Nicholson. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of IT. I'd just like to apologise for my late arrival, and thanks for Guido for stepping in as our MC. And I believe we had a few technical problems, which is never good for a Faculty of IT. Okay, so yeah, that was just fascinating, and I'm actually really looking forward to looking at the embroidery. I once embroidered one thing and I hated it, but now that there's machines to do it in software, yeah. All right. So next we've got Dr. Tom Chandler, who will speak to us about archives, records, and accounts, visualizing the royal capital of medieval Angkor. So this is a virtual heritage journey, and in his project, they simulate a day in 12th century Angkor and its people. And guided by AI, the people or the agents in this follow different agendas, and that gives the viewers an informed and multifaceted experience of the medieval capital. And this is a long-term project of Tom's and the faculty's, and every time I see it and hear about it, I find it amazing. So welcome, Tom.
Thanks for inviting me here to speak this evening, and thanks to Jean and Phyllis Whyte. Without their generous bequest, a lot of this research I'm going to show you wouldn't really be possible. I'm going to show you some things that date back a little way, but not too far away. I hope that there's some new material here for some of you who've seen it before. So I think I like to start on this slide. One thing everyone, when they think about journeying to Angkor, or they see it in tourist brochures, or they see it on TV documentaries, or any images you might see anywhere, it's always presented as kind of a dead city, choked in these vines. It's a relic, it's a ruin, it's mysterious, it's enigmatic. I'm really much more interested in putting the living city back together. So some quick overview slides of where we're standing. And I should say that I really should have updated the introduction. I'm sorry, I just didn't get around to it. But really what I'm talking about today is the entire city of Angkor. I'm going to avoid Angkor Wat almost entirely. So that's part of it. That is one little, you can see it here in the middle there. But really I'm looking at the rest of the city. So we're talking about the year 1300. It's a very interesting year for Angkor because that's the beginning of the end. It's when everything is at its peak and also just before everything starts to fall apart. That's the extent of it. This is probably the only visualization of the whole city done by National Geographic, roughly the size of Melbourne, roughly. Biggest city in the world around that 1300. 750,000 people. So biggest in size, not necessarily in people, but some interesting comparison slides that show you the immensity of it. And I'll get to why I like Angkor as a really massive archive. It really is a huge archive. But some comparison slides before I return to that point. There's London, 11th century, and there's the West Barai. It's a reservoir that can still be seen today from space. There it is today. It's all man-made. Another slide here, this is Angkor Wat and Leiden comparison. So we are really talking about a huge metropolis. This is the area that we've been trying to cram into a virtual model. We can't treat it all equally, but there's different areas that we kind of look at in different, I guess, different varying degrees of detail, I think. So this was put together by a colleague of mine, Sarah Klassen, and this really shows an animation of population density over time in the city. And this was assembled after about 12 years of collecting pottery sherds from various teams of archaeologists. And I'm just trying to get it towards the end point there. So I think we're getting up towards the end. Could you put it so you can see the timeline? So if right there, you can see that that's 1300. You can see that that's the highest concentration of everything happening at Angkor. So the main sources, the inscriptions, This is really, when I'm talking about archives, records, and accounts, these are the main things I'm drawing upon. The archaeological research, the French accounts from the colonial period, the testimony of the bas-reliefs, which you can see here, which are like visual comics of Angkor, of life at Angkor, and the accounts of a Chinese emissary who visited in 1296. These are very important. There's also all these supplementary references that we use to put these things together, like textile studies, architectural surveys, paleontological studies, which is studies of pollen cores, and archival photography. So there's one other source, which is quite a large one, and that's the LiDAR overflight of Angkor, which is done in 2013 by my colleague Damien Evans. This involved flying a helicopter back and forth over Angkor and shooting down lasers from an airborne helicopter LiDAR that would hit the trees, and some of them would hit the ground. And then you take the model back and you delete the trees and you get the points that hit the ground, and then you can see what's under the trees. And what it revealed was a whole lot more. This is Angkor Wat, for instance, and that's what's underneath the forest around Angkor Wat. They couldn't excavate this previously. This is all unknown to the archaeologists. They had no idea where all these little streets were. That's how it kind of worked. So some time ago, it's almost 10 years ago now, this came out and we decided to run in and make a model of it. And then we decided that wasn't enough. We had to get inside the model. We had to animate it. We had to have people walking around it. So that's where we ended up with that. But then we started to kind of move along to the rest of the city. And here's where I'd say that if we go just back to Angkor as an archive, I think one of the things that's really fascinating me about Angkor is that it was never built on, nobody ever built on top of it. So after about 1400, everyone starts to abandon the city and it's left there, the forests grow over it, but no city was put on top of it. So everything is very well preserved. It also wasn't destroyed. It wasn't destroyed by any armies. It just kind of faded away. So really it's one of the best preserved medieval cities anywhere, for that fact. I used to say that we're animators, but really we're model makers. And we're following in the same tradition as these Cambodians who are carving the statues here on the right. We craft things out of models. So I guess we're in the tradition of really large-scale diorama building, as you would see them in museums. These were very popular in the early 1900s up until the 1960s even. But these are frozen moments in time. I think to go back a little, I guess, to the 40s or 50s, one of the patron saints of our discipline of 3D modeling, I find, is Frances Glessner Lee, who in the 1940s started putting together reconstructions of crime scenes in America. She was a rich heiress who had plenty of time to do this. It was very, very methodical. But these are themselves archives of specific moments in time, and they would go back and study them. So this is, she'd go and take photographs of everything and model everything to intricate little details, and these are all collections that are now shown in exhibits in the Smithsonian. So we're model makers in that sense, and some models are very complicated but straightforward to make, and others involve a whole lot of other different elements there. They're not straightforward at all. They're very back and forth. So this, for example, is there any sound? Yeah. So this is a model of a workshop that my friend Martin Polkinghorne has excavated about 7 years ago. And we went back and forth to start to build this up against the evidence that was placed in the center of the royal capital. If we swung the camera around, which I can't do here, but you would see the rest of the city around it. It's just that we have to build all that. So there's other elements we're building as well. We're also building landscapes. We've got the echoes. Yeah, the landscapes of the city. This is what most of the city actually looked like. It was full of rice fields. So it's not all built up. I'll go to the next slide. What are we doing here in this big virtual model? What kind of thing is it? I said it's kind of like a diorama, but maybe it's more like a terrarium or an aquarium, because things are always moving inside it. Things are following certain rules. And a lot of the people we build, they walk around and they follow certain rules throughout the day. And I'm very fascinated with just trying to visualize one day in the life of this city, just one day in 1300, not any particular date, which is how the city would operate. There's one other kind of archive that I'm very interested in. That's the scanning of sculptures in museums. It's particularly bronze pieces, which are very well preserved. You can see we're scanning some replicas here, but and these are in the museums as well. One of the problems that's been in the news recently is that a lot of these have been looted over the last 30 or 40 years. So a lot of the museums are quite worried about their collections and the provenance there. But they're scattered all over the world, these pieces. And these are archives. They're sculptural 3D forms of archives of Angkor, of its art and its iconography, its religion. What if we could bring these back into the virtual world? What if we could take them from the real world, we could scan them as we've done here, and we could put them back into the virtual world? Here's an example of one in the Guimet Museum in France, which I didn't scan, but it's a 3D scan. And the guy who scanned it, I got in touch with him, and he was very gracious in letting us use this and see if we could integrate it into our virtual models. And here it is. Now, this is an animation, but the sound's a bit loud, so maybe don't have the sound. But you can see this is the model here. Everything else is built by us against the evidence. None of that is actually modeled. So that's a way of integrating the real with the virtual and moving between these two. And you can actually print this out as a little 3D diorama, and you could put it on your desk. You could bring the virtual back into the real. I'm very interested in this kind of play between these two areas. Okay, I'm sorry I've got so many slides. It's just a problem I have. I delete as many as I can, and then I add more, but I go through them quite quickly. So they're mostly images. I'm also very interested in if we're going to have all these little animated people moving around, how they interact is really important. Now, we're not really making a movie where they start talking to each other and having facial expressions and conversations. It's more how I'm really interested in how social hierarchy would actually be shown by crowds moving up, and who would make way for who would take the lesser path. You get some sense of this in the archives of the bas-reliefs, although they're highly stylized and caricatured. You get a sense of what's going on. These are freeze frames. And in this animation here, you get a sense of who's deferring to who and who is in charge and who isn't. Just so you know, it's the guy on the horse who's in charge. So just little how these characters would come upon each other and what they would do was really interesting to me. This all comes from the accounts of Zhao de Guan, who visited in 1296. And it's the only eyewitness account of Angkor, and lucky we have it because Zhao de Guan gives these really, really detailed visual accounts of colors. He's very interested in status, colors and motifs, all kinds of markers. He noted all of that down. It's wonderful material to model with. So that's when I talk about accounts, it's Zhao de Guan's account. I'm very interested in fabrics in particular, just for the way that motifs carry across different cultures. So the fabrics of Angkor, they're all gone. They didn't bury their dead, and any fabrics that are there have long disappeared, but they are carved on the bas-reliefs. You can see patterns. And a few years ago, I found that there is one place where they still exist, and that's the cemeteries of Egypt, because these come from India. They were sent to Angkor. They're also sent to Egypt, but of course nothing survives in tropical Angkor, but everything survives in Egypt, where maybe it doesn't rain for 30 or 40 years. These are little fragments of the cloth that were found there. And you can see there's quite direct comparisons. You see this fish scale one, you can see the fish scale one here. So these are motifs that are carried across. So we're doing a lot of work with what the fabrics of the people, what colors they were. This is the colors of Angkor, and all of these things have to move around as they walk. There's also references to, even how they were drinking liquor at the time, rice liquor, quite hard stuff, but they were sucking it through straws, which is attested in the bas-reliefs. So we can animate all these little things here, and I'm worried about time with all my slides, but all these little animations, the sum total of all these animations, if you have 40 or 50 little animations, we call them motion loops, but that gives a character all kinds of options of moving around and all kinds of things they'll do when they're not doing much at all, even when they're sitting down, when they're weaving, when they're working, when they're pounding rice. I can't seem to move on, Keshan. Okay, and also just the colors, for example, I won't This is one I found here. I'll just read this out because it's really interesting. On the lower level, they're so-called Chen Jielan, servant women who come and go and number at least 1,000 or two. In their case, they all have husbands and live mixed among ordinary people. They shave back the top of their head and they paint with vermilion. They also paint on either side of their temples. In this way, they mark themselves as the Chen Jielan. They're the only women who can go into the palace and no one below them gets to go in. There's a continuous stream of them on the roads in front of the lower palace. This is what Zhao Deguan is saying about notes he's taking about Angkor. So this is really, it's like the sindoor that Indian women sometimes wear. I think that's what he's kind of talking about, but we're trying to visualize that. There's also the animals, which I might skip over. And there's also the records of in the inscriptions where all the plants and trees and fruit are mentioned. So we go back and we start modeling these. Anything that is in there, we'll try to model it, and then we'll try to put it into our library. We don't have to model everything, just the main things that are easily seen, particularly these banana plants that archaeologists have found outside the houses. This is for wrapping items. Could someone tell me how I'm going for time? I just want 5 minutes or so. I can't see any time here. About 5 minutes, good. Okay. So these landscapes, putting them together, this is where I'm really getting into what I'm doing for the Whyte Fund, and I'm still working on it. We've slowed down a little bit, but these are the archaeological maps. These are GIS layers, 3 layers, and they're divided into the mounds and the water. This is Angkor Thom, the great city. That's Angkor Wat, and the mounds, the water, and there's also fields. But in modeling these, we're kind of putting these all together, and then we're coding all those vegetation models I showed you, some of the houses, the architecture. We're coding that to kind of magnetize to the map, which parts they're supposed to be in. They will appear in those places. So we're using large-scale archaeological repositories like this one. It's a mapping repository of all the data from the excavations around Angkor and seeing how we can bring this into the virtual model. And the inscriptions too, which is the voice of the people of Angkor, and some of the translations of those inscriptions. So we're trying to match the places where the inscriptions were found with quotes from the inscriptions. And this is what it actually looks like. So you can move over it, fly over it, but as you do, you come across little dots that pop up and tell you what is in that place. We're moving through the seasons. We're moving kind of through time as well. Could you press play, Keshan, please? This is an earlier version of it. I'll show you just half of it. If you turn off the sound, in case there's sound, yep. But you can see this is the 3D map, and what will happen is you can move around it. And then at some point you can move down and it'll just click into place. Sorry, I was recording. I was not doing well with the mouse there, but that's what basically happens. We make a virtual world out of the map. We can go inside the map. Possibly at some stage you could walk around it, but it's all very low detail down at ground level. Okay, if you could stop, please, Keshan. Okay, so I might flick over some of these last ones in the interest of time. But of course, there's all this wooden paraphernalia around the temples that this is from Bali in the 1900s. I mean, this stuff is all gone. This is going to be very hard to reconstruct. And this is why some of this project can just take so long. But could you press play, please? In the LiDAR overflights, this is what the actual LiDAR looks like once we get it into our model. So these are all the point clouds. So this is the model of Angkor as it is today. And then we're overlaying that with the archaeological map of Angkor as it was. And then on top of that, we put the 3D models that we've reconstructed that match the archaeological map. If you could press play, please. Yep. And this is one of the applications that came out of this research was a way, we call it a subtractive map, but this is all the layers of our map put together where you rub off one and you can see another one. So there's underneath this is the archaeological map. On top, this gray stuff is all our 3D models. three models of trees, of houses, temples. And then if we want to see what is underneath all that, we can go to the LiDAR, which also sits underneath that. So it's a way of layering all this information together. Could you go to the next slide? I'll just go to the next, sorry. Okay, so I was going to talk finally about sounds and the latest collaboration I have, and I think I'll end there. But one of the other things that came out of this is what would Angkor have sounded like? And I've been there many times and taken field recordings of just villages and, you know, wind going through the trees, anything I can get hold of. But sound was extremely important in any kind. If you're going to try and visualize any scene from medieval times, sound is extremely important, as this quote from David Garriock says. About 3 years ago, I met an ethnomusicologist over in Angkor who seemed to have been working in parallel with me, and we knew about each other but had never met. And he'd been trying to reconstruct the instruments of Angkor, which have vanished, most of them. They've vanished, they've been gone for 700 years. He's looking at the bas-reliefs, and then he's actually making them. He's going off to Nepal and getting them cast in bronze. He's much more 3D than we ever could be. You know, he's really putting them into real pieces. So from that, I think I might click over these. From that, what the latest, I guess, permutation of this map. So this map it's never really stable. It starts, we keep making new things out of it. None of this is just one thing. It's something that generates more research. We've been able to make a sonic map. And in this map, which is in virtual reality, and is you can see it at Monash Clayton. You come to our lab, you put on the virtual reality headset, and from around waist level, a map of Angkor appears in front of you, and it stretches. Oh, it would stretch right up to the far end of this building here. I tried it out at home, and I could walk into the bathroom and the kitchen, and the map was still there as long as I was feeling where I was going. But if you lean down, you can hear sounds coming out of the map, and we've placed the map from the sounds that the ethnomusicologist Patrick Casal gave to us. We placed them around the temples. So you start to hear, I mean, it's hard to get the melodies or something, but you really are walking in the map. And it's almost like you're the size of Godzilla. You can walk through it, and that's why it's an X-ray style, and you can hear different sounds coming through it. So it's kind of a sonic map of Angkor. I think I better stop there. Sorry for having so many slides. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, fantastic set of slides, and just a reflection, I think, of the amazing body of work that's been done over so many years. So our final presentation of the evening will be delivered by Emerita Professor Sue McKemmish and Dr. Narissa Timbery. Narissa not here? Oh, she's in my notes. Not okay, sorry. The Communique on Indigenous Data Sovereignty, Mayam Nayi Wingara, 2018, addresses all individuals and entities involved in the creation, collection, access, analysis, interpretation, management, dissemination, and reuse of data and data infrastructure in Australia. So it asserts the right of First Nations people to exercise ownership, autonomy, and governance over their data. So working with First Nations elders, communities and organisations, Emerita Professor McKemmish and Dr. Timbery are co-designing frameworks, models, protocols and systems to support data sovereignty, living archives and repatriation of archives and cultural material back to country. So just fascinated to hear about that project as the last for the evening. So welcome, Sue.
So I'm delighted to be here with you tonight. Unfortunately, Narissa cannot be with us today, so I'm presenting on behalf of her and all of the team of researchers that are involved in this project, who are listed on the slide here. Narissa's at a writing retreat at the Macquarie University, so I think she's sorry to miss out, but I think the writing retreat was a very important event for her. We acknowledge the First Nations peoples of the unceded lands where we gather, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung and Bunurong Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation. And we also acknowledge the First Nations peoples of the lands that guests are coming and joining us either here or online. And all of the First Nations communities that we've partnered with over the years, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to First Nations friends and colleagues here and online. And we're really pleased to share with you information about this 4-year project, which relates to Indigenous data sovereignty and living archives on country, and is supported very generously by the Whyte Fund. Our research project is a response to the Indigenous data sovereignty movement, which is an essential enabler of First Peoples sovereignty. And our overall goals are to support the development of living archives on country in partnership with First Nations communities, and also Indigenous data sovereignty through record keeping and archival sovereignty in partnership with the Melbourne Museum. We're experimenting with a special form of partnership, and we're calling it a research collective. And the partners that have come together include the Indigenous Archive Collective, and you can see some of the leading members of the collective in the photo there. Indigenous communities, the Jumbana University Centre at the Jumbana University of Technology, Dr. Kirsten Thorpe, Dr. Lauren Booker, and Monika Galassi, our key collaborators there. Melbourne Museum First Peoples Research Centre and the First Peoples collections, which are managed by Dr. Shannon Forkhead, who is also an adjunct with our faculty. So the idea of the collective is that it will not only collaborate and complement each other's research, but we'll also advocate for translating that research into practice. Probably thinking, what is First Nations sovereignty? And I'm going to quote from the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And in quoting from the Uluru Statement from the Heart, I also should acknowledge the devastating impact that the loss of the referendum on a voice has had on our Indigenous colleagues and friends and all Indigenous people in Australia. So the Uluru Statement says, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, according to the reckoning of their culture from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This ancient sovereignty has never been ceded or extinguished and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. So this movement in Australia is closely linked to claims for Indigenous data sovereignty, which is very important in enabling many aspects of First Nations sovereignty itself. And it's a movement that's happening all around the world amongst Indigenous and First Nations peoples. And they point to how data has been weaponised against them in colonial settler societies. We're a colonial settler society here in Australia. And I'll just quote from one of the authors in the book that I've featured on the slide. In the digital age, governments are increasingly dependent on data and data analytics to inform their policies and decision making. However, Indigenous peoples have often been the unwilling targets of policy interventions and have had little say over the collection, use and application of data about them, their land and their cultures. Our current research builds on the foundational Australian Research Council funded project called Trust and Technology, which we were involved in from 2003 to 2006. And that was led by Professor Lynette Russell, who is the director of the Monash Indigenous Studies Centre. And to quote from that, one of the key findings of that project was that Western archival science and practice reflect and reinforce a privileging of settler, invader, colonist voices and narratives over Indigenous ones, of written over oral records. Further, the conventional positioning of individuals as the subjects of the official archival record has had a particularly disempowering effect on Indigenous peoples whose lives have been so extensively documented in archives for the purposes of surveillance, control, and dispossession, including removal of cultural materials, which we see in many of the museums and archives in Australia, and in fact all around the world. There are materials from Indigenous peoples in Australia, and Tom, in his fantastic presentation, showed some examples of those in the case of Angkor Wat. So there's massive movement of cultural materials out of the communities where they originated. So in Australia, data more generally has been defined as weaponised against Indigenous peoples since colonisation, and it continues to be used against them in the digital environment. And in a digital environment, this is often compounded by artificial intelligence technologies. There are also the records and the data that you find in archival institutions and currently in records holders under records holders controls in all sorts of organisations are actually managed in knowledge structures that are so alien to Indigenous ways of knowing. And the classification schemes, catalogues and descriptive systems that embed the worldviews and values of the mainstream and include very racist and negative constructs of indigeneity are part of this knowledge structuring. And such records have supported and continue to support the removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, which is happening today in record numbers. In our research, we've adopted the Indigenous Data Sovereignty Communique's definition of this concept, as our focus is on records. Some other definitions of Indigenous data sovereignty focus on quantitative and statistical data, and there are research teams exploring that kind of data, but we're looking at records and archives because that's the area that we specialise in. And I don't really need to read that out because Anne has already referred to it and shared some of it with us. But essentially it's about defining data in a very broad way to include all of the kinds of records and archives that we're concerned with, and also asserting rights of ownership over that, and whether it's created by Indigenous peoples themselves or it's about them, has been created about them, and also asserts governance over that data as well. So there have been networks relating to Indigenous data sovereignty established in many different places, but particularly some of the settler colonial societies, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the United States. And there's a growing interest in the Pacific and Scandinavia, and also in Mexico. And collectively, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia and the other Indigenous peoples in other parts of the world are saying that data sovereignty is essential. It's as an expression and an enabler of Indigenous rights, Indigenous well-being and self-determination. And they also see that what they're offering and what they understand by this and how it should be, the stewardship of this and the care for this, that they are offering a transformative vision of what they think are good data practices. And they believe that the benefits of that could extend far beyond their own communities. Now, our definition of records taking many forms is very much aligned with these definitions that come from the Indigenous data sovereignty networks and movement. They can take many different forms. Tom has beautifully illustrated that the archive, the record, is in so many different forms. They may be spoken, written, performed. They may be captured in oral and written records, but in literature, in landscape, in dance, in art, in buildings, in songlines, and in artefacts. Because all of these things provide traces of social and cultural and organisational activity that evidence and memorialise individual and collective lives. And of course, they're also embodied in people and embedded in country, which again, Tom has shown us how that works. And this is the amazing Budj Bim UNESCO World Heritage Site in Western Victoria. If you haven't visited, I would urge you to visit. It goes back thousands and thousands of years. There are stone huts there. There are eel smoking trees. There is the earliest and largest and best, probably, aquacultural site in the world, where they built into the volcanic rock channels and fish traps. It's an amazing, amazing site, and it is amazing evidence that not all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the past were nomadic, as was claimed, and that indeed there were stone huts and other dwellings in that place, and they were trading to the north, and that's why they smoked their eels. Moving on. So our first research goal relates to living archives on country. And this is something that Shannon Forkhead and Tom Chandler and I have been very interested in for a long time. And this is what we imagine, and this comes from one of our papers, that we can actually bring all records relating to a particular community together in this new form of living archives on country, one that would turn all the assumptions of existing collecting kinds of archives on their head. And that this would mean experiencing records on country in the context of other records that already exist there and have been connected back through time with that place, including those embodied in the landscape community and people. And then you can imagine the kind of work that Tom is doing and how it, through the technologies that he uses, can also bring to integrate into that living archives on country different kinds of experiences that you can have through virtual reality. And so it's very exciting to think about all those possibilities. And to support this goal, these are the kinds of things that we're doing. It's a wonderful photograph of a recent graduation of Dr. Kirsten Thorpe, and Dr. Shannon Forkhead is on your right, and Narissa Timbery, my co-presenter, who's now Dr. Timbery. And these are the things that together we want to try to do to build living archives on country. And I'm sure at some stage we'll be reaching out to Tom and also quite a lot of our more technology-minded colleagues to help us with achieving these things. All sorts of frameworks, protocols and processes are really important. Repatriation is the key to this. Archives, museums, giving up their grasp. Kirsten calls her thesis Ungrasping the White Hand, giving up their grasp on the records and letting them be returned to country, either digitally or the actual records themselves. So all sorts of innovative systems are needed to manage all of this process and to make these records accessible in the communities. And importantly, ongoing funding strategies are needed and guidance on negotiating alternative storage if if ownership of records has passed to communities, making arrangements with GLAM institutions that are perhaps continue to play the role of looking after the physical record. Now, our research in this area builds on foundation research undertaken by Dr. Kirsten Thorpe in her thesis and Narissa in her PhD research. And this research that Narissa undertook extends Kirsten's vision by providing step-by-step guidance on developing a living digital archives on country that would be part of the larger living archives. And again, Narissa's work involved yarning to a lot of people who were involved in Tom's earlier Monash Country Lines project, and I've forgotten how to pronounce the new name of that project, Tom, but thank you. So she's developed a model of what are the requirements for this kind of living digital archive on country, and she envisages it as a space of intergenerational learning and embodying community archival and record keeping sovereignty, and also being managed by strengths-based community-driven protocols and processes and community-centred technologies and documentation strategies. So to support the second goal, which relates to Indigenous record keeping and archival sovereignty, we're developing all these kinds of things: charters of rights in record keeping and archiving for First Peoples, a charter of lifelong rights in childhood record keeping for stolen generations and First Nations children in care, all sorts of implementation tools to help with that, guidelines for translating the work that we've been doing into treaty provisions, and models for reforming laws that relate to public records and archives. And a lot of this comes from the work that Kirsten did and her vision of what sorts of things needed to be put in place to support Indigenous wellbeing and sovereignty in an archival context. So finishing up just quickly, Indigenous-led, sorry, I'll just start again. What we would really envision for the future includes Indigenous-led transformation of Indigenous archival frameworks, policies and practice, guided by the principle of nothing about us without us. And non-Indigenous record keeping and archival communities walking with Indigenous colleagues, working together for archival self-determination and autonomy. Also, structural reform of the sector to enable holistic Indigenous living archives on country, supported by repatriation of records and archives. And the museums are very are starting to be very good at doing this, and that's why the partnership with Melbourne Museum is very important to see if this can translate into the archival world. And resourcing, of course, and perhaps even considering some redistribution of budgets relating to archives, which currently are almost entirely provide resources to government archives at national and state level, and community archives are not well supported. There is another option that could be explored. Some of you may well have visited the Bunjalaka Aboriginal Cultural Centre within the Museum of Melbourne, which was developed in partnership with Victorian Aboriginal communities. And that is another model, the idea of an independent Indigenous archives within another archival institution that is supported in the way the Bunjalaka Museum is supported by the museum. And the final thing I should mention is truth-telling by the archives themselves, truth-telling by public and state archives about their role in colonisation is another essential factor. And so in closing, we'd really like to express our appreciation for Jean and Phyllis Whyte's bequests and their support for research and PhD students in our field, which have enabled some wonderful research to happen. And we hope that our research will be translated into practice, and that will then be part of our legacy as well as Jean and Phyllis's legacies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue. So that's concludes the three presentations today. So I hope everyone's really enjoyed hearing about such diverse projects, but really, you know, we've seen elements of the same thing, which is around how creative and exciting it can be, where technology and systems and record keeping and archives can come together in these really interesting, diverse ways. And I really hope that hearing about these projects today might inspire new ideas from other attendees and researchers and people online about how we can better use information systems and technology to empower communities and facilitate the sort of the creation, capture and transfer of that important knowledge. So next we have got time for a Q&A and panel discussion. Because we started late, we will you know, take the time to do that. I know that if people, especially those online, have to go, they do, but put online people to put into the Q&A, and I think we might even, maybe we even show the Q&A up on the side or something, try and work out the best way for me to have a look at that. But I will, there's going to be roving mic as well, is that correct? Or is this the roving mic for the audience? Just shout out and I'll repeat the question for the online people. Or pop that into the question box on Zoom. So we'll ask the speakers to come up. Oh, before I do that, we should just really thank our speakers for their presentations anyway. Yeah, so now come up, have a seat. First of all though, any questions from the audience? I've got a couple prepared, but happy to start with the audience. No, I will. So we did hear Tom mentioned, I think at some point that, or it was in the background, that AI is part of sort of what's being used. I don't know if that's real AI or chat GPT AI or just smart algorithms and used in your work. And so you talked about it as something that's more increasingly found in the way that government's looking at, or government and organisations and businesses using data. So I'm just wondering, any comments? Actually, I don't know if AI was part of that smart embroidery. But what do you think about the recent emerging technological developments
AI, natural language and so on, and how that might have an impact either on your projects or more generally on the future of sort of information archives that you're keeping. That can be specific or a bigger picture.
I'll have to go. I think probably shouldn't be in there. My project AI. The AI we use is we just tell our characters, the little walking people, how to get around the city. They're really stupid. I wouldn't call them intelligent. They're very, very stupid. They just do repetitive things. But I've always said if you flew over Melbourne, hovered over Melbourne, and you just watch people come out of the buildings, go to lunch, go to the car, and get in the car, and they do the same thing all the time. So we're looking at that kind of macro level. But I'm also interested in things like AI image generators. When you put in prompts, and it will, you say look like a little cute fox with a top hat and a bow tie, and it will give you one just immediately like that. But it's really interesting when you, Mike, my PhD student and I, the first thing when it was getting to be easy to do about a year ago, we started putting in prompts for Angkor to see if it could visualize it for us. And the funny thing was that it couldn't at all, because it just brought up images of tourist photos of ruins. And then it started, if we prompted it in a certain direction, it started to draw on the images that we had already put on the internet, which I thought was really, so maybe I'm hoping that there's kind of a safe space for us, because it's hard for AI to reconstruct Angkor unless someone's done it before. And I wouldn't say that we've done it yet. So it has very few images to draw upon, which is interesting in itself, because you really have to dig around and look at a lot of different things, and you have to discuss it with all these historians and archaeologists and art historians who all disagree with each other, and there'll be multiple views and lots of uncertainty. So it's hard to come up with something there. There's not enough there yet for AI to draw upon to just generate it. Yeah.
So for my project generally, I didn't use any AI, but I also just given those of 2100 billion, and we have 13,600. So when my exhibition currently is shown, it's in the courtroom number 1 in the penitentiary chapel. In courtroom number 2, there's a huge display of a column now, which actually the goal is to show not just 21 life courses, it's to show 780,000 life courses, and we are using AI for that. So we are actually using historical images and images of descendants to create new imagery to give convict women and convict men a face. It's not accurate, it's not the real face, but it does a lot to bring people alive. So we're actually using it.
To that, because I remember talking to Hamish, who's working with Monika Schwarz. It was really, really interesting what he was doing with the records. So I think Monika mentioned that they have a physical description of a convict man. Blue eyes, smallpox scars, and 5'5", dark hair, slightly balding, all little things that would mark them. And you can feed that into the system to generate an image that matches that kind of identikit. But then what's also interesting that Hamish was saying is that I think there was a photographer, was it early 1900s, 1890s? Was it? There's a photographer who went to Hobart in 1890s or 1900s and took pictures of a whole lot of people. And it just happened to be most likely the grandchildren, or great-grandchildren of the convicts. So at least, I mean, it's a bit of a long shot, because, you can't put, often if you get to the family photos and you look at your great-grandparents and put yourself there, it's not a strict present, but it's better than just a random person. So using that kind of pool to try and reconstruct the people, I find that really interesting. You never get, it's never accurate, but you get something is there.
Do they have guest maps at the Hobart Penitentiary? Because the old Melbourne jail has a collection of death marks with people that were executed there. And if they were actually scanned in, you'd have an actual representation of the convict. But of course, then there's the issues of it's actually, the record of the person.
Right, let me finish that.
Yes.
Yeah.
we have some spent depth masks. There's creepy as hell.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's exactly the problem. You actually have to face with a diseased person. It's we all feel uncomfortable about this, right? I think it's just one step too close. But yeah, they're there. We thought about using them.
And maybe if it was more like an interpretation, if it wasn't the exact, replication of it, because that would be free.
Exactly like Tom was saying, if it just feeds into the final image, that changes things. But yeah, AI is new and we all still try and find out how to actually use it in the correct way.
In relation to, I guess the main focus has been in relation to Indigenous data sovereignty, and all of the things that I was talking about has been on the use of AI in ways which are very harmful and damaging. So facial recognition, racial profiling, and things happening in a black box that you don't actually understand what the values are in that box, what the biases are in that box, and yet it can have a terrible impact on your life. I don't know how far AI, for example, if at all, was involved in the robo-debt system. I presume it may well have been, but that's an example of the kind of thing that if it's used in ways that assume that the sorts of things that you were saying about the convict women, that the people who are applying for Centrelink, sort of people like that, they are likely to be trying to rip off the system. They're dole bludgers, all those kinds of things, and you get similar things in a racist sense in the Indigenous, for the Indigenous peoples as well. But on the other hand, I think it's really exciting if we can start to co-design with Indigenous peoples amazing kinds of applications that might be really beneficial in terms of the sorts of things like a living archive on the country.
Yeah, so just sort of in summary, I mean, when we're talking about records and using archives, when there's a lot of data, then, the AI can be trained or useful, but it's also the case that that's taking it beyond what individual people, or that would be very expensive to have, humans do, one by one. So I guess that there's elements there about your specific cases. I noticed on the chat in particular that an anonymous attendee asking about how this relates to the IT industry. And I do want to sort of pick up on that, because I think sometimes in our, university research, we are working on these very challenging problems and often at the forefront of technology, otherwise it wouldn't be research. But we do know that industry is moving ahead very fast anyway, and industry also does pick up on our research and take it and use it, sometimes in the same ways and sometimes in different. So I'm just not sure if anyone wanted to sort of comment on either opportunities or things that are happening in the IT industry that sort of resonate with some of the things we talked about today.
Could I just say something? I think in terms of for issues that relate to our to communities and individual Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples, I think it's about making changes, which our faculty is doing, in the way that people are educated to be technology experts and to work with people, because working with communities and actually co-designing things with communities, there's a lot of things that you need to learn about working together with communities and about how you co-design as well, that could make a very big difference, but it needs to be built into the educational structure right from the undergraduate degree on.
I might add a comment to that. Yeah, I think that really the IT industry, but and the way we teach our
students is the idea that some people who are technical experts can sit off somewhere over there and know what system people want to use or need to use, and can sort of design it and create it and sort of give it to them as something that'll be useful. We've really moved away from that. I mean, how many of us sort of sit there completely frustrated by some element of our systems anyway? So it's not that we've got there yet, but we've really moved away from that idea that you can create a useful system without bringing the user and their experience into that creation process, and whether it's through co-design or whether it's what's sometimes called user-centered design and so on. I mean, there's many, there's no one accepted methodology in that, but I think that the spirit of that, moving to that, is what we've been hearing about today. I'm not sure I can pick up on the assisting quadriplegic technology people, but I'll give a quick plug. There's a question about that on the thing that another thing we do in the Faculty of IT at Monash is that we have amazing researchers working in interdisciplinary ways with people in allied health and so on to look at assistive and inclusive technology for helping people participate in the world, you know, whether that's through work or education or cultural activities. And that's really exciting research, and that is done in a co-design way as well, with people from those cohorts and communities being part of that co-design. So I'm just picking up on a question about that in the chat. Anyone else in the room have a question now? We've got a couple. Oh, if you're speaking, I'll repeat.
First question is about data sovereignty. So, if I understand correctly, you say that all data that is related to Indigenous communities and civilians should be managed by them. But then, where you draw the line, so at least not to overwhelm those who would be responsible for this. I mean, if you think about all the government organizations that and all the data they have and all the governance around these data sets, I mean, if you could imagine that we need Indigenous people to be responsible. I mean, it's more work, it's an effort, and I wonder how we could not make it a burden for them, and also not hand over, to avoid keeping the data and not giving them a saying, you know, like there are two sides for this problem, and I wonder what you take in this case. One question at a time?
One at a time. Yeah, I'm not sure if that got picked up, but this is a broader question about what Indigenous data sovereignty means, given how much data is sort of kept by government and other organisations, and what level of sort of being able to give Indigenous communities, I guess, ownership and control of that is sort of feasible in a practical sense. I'm giving a bit of a translation there.
Yes, I mean, it's a huge issue, and it's an issue that applies to many other communities as well. And I think that the starting point has to be the systemic stuff rather than down to the level of all the data that's being collected in all the systems. So it's about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people engaging in the actual decisions that are made about the way data is going to be created and governed, and what the governance framework is going to be, what the sort of legislative structures are going to be, what the policies are going to be that make the rules about this stuff, and to get sort of the principles in place and the rights in place that relate to that, so that as people are starting to design new systems and to continue to collect data in the past, they don't continue to do it in the organisation-centred way that they have done it in the past. They do it in a way where their focus is on people, the people-centred way. And I think that would work for all of us. Because we're all frustrated, I think, with all the data that's being collected about us and that we don't know about, and that could be used in ways which will harm us. And for people who are vulnerable and have in the past been treated in the way many vulnerable communities have, and particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, things have to change. And I think it's about involving people in the big decisions to start with.
Yeah, that's a great question. Before I know you've got another one, I just want to check anyone else got a question.
Yeah, I guess I've got a question again. It relates to Indigenous data sovereignty. A lot of the Indigenous data, so whether that's museum objects or records, are held in kind of collected institutions that have a lot of infrastructure around that. I'm interested in the idea of that, holding some of these experiencing records on site, on country, and I guess what the vision would be behind that. So it's given that, current institutions have there's so much resourcing that needs to go into that at the moment. So what does that model that's been presented kind of extend that into on-country experiences?
Yes. Well, it may be that individual communities don't decide that they want to have repatriation, or it may be that they do. So they're two of the, I guess, the main outcomes that might be there once you start consulting with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And I think that it's really important to think again at the level of policies and funding policies in this area. Should there be resources made available to communities that would like to have their own archives on country? Now, the Gunditj Mara community, that's where Budjabim is, through all the work that they did to get it declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site, they managed to get a lot of resources to support them in developing what I guess is a really good model of a living archive on country. But at the end of the day, I was saying it's about archival institutions giving up something and taking, not grasping it anymore so close to them. At the end of the day, it is about issues to do with economics and funding. Why isn't there funding available for community archives? Why is it all focused in government archives? We don't actually in Australia have a national archives. We don't have state archives. Our so-called national and state archives are government archives. And how far could that start to be shared between institutions and communities? And maybe communities given the opportunity to say, well, you guys are really good. You've got a lot of infrastructure and looking after things. Could you please continue to do that? But the ownership moves to us. The stewardship moves to us, and we consult with you about how you'll be managing records on our behalf. And we could also go the way that I think Melbourne Museum is going to go, which they're going to say, if we repatriate a collection to a community, Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander community, in our budget, there are funds allocated per collection. That's one of the ways that they do things. And we'll actually transfer the budget that goes with the collection to the community. So that's another way of thinking about it.
And I also think that the model of bringing all the physical artifacts into one centralised place for a whole range of reasons, historically that model, that digital technologies also help us break down that model, because we know that many more people can access information and digitised versions and things anyway. So at the moment, they're often still sitting somewhere that's centralised and everyone else is outside, but a far more distributed model of at least where the digital
material sits and how it's accessed and controlled and things, I think would be quite interesting as well. That's just a sort of a thought. Yep.
What's also interesting is when you talk about physical artifacts, the ability to scan them and to keep a replica of them, I think is really interesting problem that's happening in museums all around the world now. I've spoken to several PhD students with interest in this area, and one PhD student I have who's based in New Zealand looking at Maori artifacts in particular is so for example, if there's something you can hold, I'm talking about physical artifacts, something that's you can hold that's material. If it's returned, what if the museum scans it before it's returned? Are they allowed to keep that replica? Who owns the replica of? Because
3D
remember,
print.
exactly, you can print this out again. But I think it's a conversation that's happening a lot in Africa too, with all the West African bronzes that have been taken to Europe. They were taken out of Benin and those places, and now they're getting returned. But the curators they don't want to return, but they have to. They're taking scans of them. But who owns that replica scan? So you can have two copies of something. It's very much the problem of the age. You know, what is authenticity? What is the real thing? Well, obviously the original artifact is the real thing, but how can you repatriate both? And then what if you're repatriating those objects in a digital collection that you can view in front of you in augmented reality and people can access that? What if you're trying to, in the case of bronzes, in the cases of pieces of architectural assemblies like the Elgin marbles, what if you're scanning them in order to repatriate them in a digital sense? You're rebuilding them back into the context that they were based on the evidence. There's all kinds of interesting ways about looking at these archive models.
And could I just add quickly to that I don't think you should start with the assumption that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, Indigenous people exercising their sovereignty will not negotiate things like this. I think you start from the assumption that it's then about negotiation and it's about working together, walking together, and working out what is possible and coming to perhaps an agreement to say, yes, we would like the original back, but we have decided that it would be great to have something that technology can enable still with the museum or archives. And so I think sometimes people panic and they think automatically, oh no, all this stuff will just be taken away without these kinds of other possibilities opening up.
Maybe last quick question.
My question about the simulation, it's fascinating, but can it be possibly applied to a modern day city, say Melbourne, and as a kind of a more useful digital tool than what the Victorian government has?
Yes, yeah. Certainly. So the question was whether the simulation I've done of this medieval city could be applied to modern contexts, such as Melbourne, for example. Yes. If I was able to get to the next 30 slides, I had to show you. But one thing that has come out of this is that process I was talking about when I talked about rebuilding landscapes and trees and vegetation based on the evidence. So this is a new direction I'm headed in now, that those kind of techniques and those kind of methodologies, we're working with the CSIRO to reconstruct, well, not to reconstruct, to cast forwards in the future about how landscapes will change given climate change scenarios. So really what you have to start with there, let's say it's the River Red Gum forests along the Murray, and all the rivers in Australia have these. Ecologists often start with this thing called a reference state, and I'll get to your question about cities in a second, but a reference state, which is nominally about 1750, a very interesting date, pre-colonization. It's when that ecosystem was in its its healthiest, fullest extent. And then after that, it starts to fragment, invasive species are introduced, cows and sheep, and all kinds of things happen. So that reference state is where you start, and then they've got other states or expressions of how this ecosystem changes, which we're now modeling. The thing with climate change, this happens naturally. With climate change, these states, they change much faster. So I think in a long way to answer your question, we can use techniques from this for modeling of medieval cities to cast forwards into the future. One last thing I'd add, though, is what I'd like to do with Melbourne is peel it backwards. I just want to go backwards. So you start with what's here, and then you go backwards 200 years until you get to a landscape that's entirely under Indigenous management. It's quite something else. How is that useful? Well, the concepts like rewilding, the concepts like thinking, well, what is the original state of this landscape? You can use that in simulations and virtuality. You can explore that, and then you're informed about how to build it. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people doing things around smart cities and looking at modelling the cities and how people work and how we should organise traffic and all of these things. So I think that there's a fair amount that having possibly more than you know about, those traffic lights that aren't the same sometimes of the day. Anyway, look, I think that we need to wind up. That was just terrific. Like to thank again our expert speakers.